Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ted Gardner, and I'm a lucky guy. I'm an interviewer for the Oral History Project here at our public library. And I've had the joy and the pleasure of interviewing 164 people. You're in 165. And we have the honor and the pleasure to meet Bob Stachler this afternoon, Korean War veteran, citizen of Cincinnati. Where were you born, Bob?
I was born in Steubenville, Ohio.
Steubenville, way up, yeah.
And I grew up on a farm outside of Dayton, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up at Dayton and University of Dayton. And from there I ended up at law school at Cincinnati Law School. And I've been practicing law for over 50 years now with Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister.
Oh my goodness sakes.
So that's my background.
Well, that's a wonderful background. So you, when you started, well, tell me about your family, your mom and dad and so forth.
Well, my mother and father were divorced when I was 2 years old, and so I was put in a foster home out in the country.
I'll be darned.
And that's where I spent 4 or 5 years before my mother, who was a nurse in Rome City, Indiana, came back and picked my brother and me up, and we ended up living with her father in St. Mary's, Ohio, before I ended up in Dayton.
So you started school in Dayton, or?
No, I started school, grade school, in Montezuma, Ohio, if you know where that is.
Montezuma, oh my gosh.
And then from Montezuma over to St. Mary's, and from St. Mary's to Dayton to the Holy Trinity School in the Dayton area. Holy Trinity School at that time was serviced by nuns who were raised and taught in a reform school to be able to take care of young
tough kids.
And that's why my mother enrolled me there.
Well, you certainly have had a very interesting background. Where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at Chaminade.
Oh yeah.
Chaminade, back at the time I was there, was dominant in football.
Yep.
In the Dayton area, and I had the privilege, of course, of playing football there under Fuzzy Fouts, who was well known, whose son was Jerry Fouts, who came to Moeller later. But I had a wonderful opportunity going to school at Chaminade.
Oh, that's great. Well, then, in everybody's life, there. I was going to ask you, you have siblings?
I have, I'm married. I have 5 children.
You have 5
and
children.
17 grandchildren.
Wow.
And I hope we've reached the end of the line.
Well, now, in everybody's life, there are certain dates that one never forgets where he or she was, and of course Pearl Harbor Day is one of the big ones in our lives. Where were you on Pearl Harbor Day?
Pearl Harbor Day, I was coming out of a local theater, and I recall, what was it, December the 7th? And of course at that time I was in high school.
Right. And what decided that you would go into the service? Were you drafted, or did you volunteer, or what was your situation?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I received a football scholarship to play at the University of Dayton.
Uh-huh.
And I was told that in order to make few bucks. Why don't you join the ROTC
Yeah.
in college? You get $30 a month. $30 a month was like $1 million in today's market. So when I signed up for my scholarship to go to school free, I decided, well, I'll sign up for the ROTC program at University of Dayton.
Wonderful.
And I can remember, incidentally, vividly, when I was standing in line to get my uniform. And the sergeant was giving out the uniforms. When I approached him, he said, that'd be $50.
Ooh.
I said, for my uniform? I'm on a scholarship. He said, I don't give a damn. What you are, you're in the Army now. And that was my first experience with the Army.
Welcome to the Army.
Welcome to the Army. And so I came up with my $50 and then signed up for the program.
Right.
And
So-
graduated then with as a second lieutenant.
All right. Yeah, that college ROTC in those days was a very solid foundation for a lot of good training and a lot of good people.
It was very, very active at Dayton,
Mm-hmm.
and the soldiers full-time
Sure.
ranked from a colonel down to sergeants, and was very, very helpful to me, and I enjoyed it very much.
Right. Now during World War II, you were in college, right?
I was in college. Well, the war ended when I became a freshman, because I can recall vividly many of the veterans coming back playing football, and of course we were just young kids playing with these older soldiers who had been discharged from the service. So on the teams that I played with, many of them were soldiers who come back from service.
Well, and I imagine for a youngster like you, bright and patriotic and so forth, you probably gained some knowledge from the old timers that came back, the veterans that had been overseas and so forth.
Yes, I did, and appreciated that opportunity to be exposed to them.
Right.
They were much more mature than the average college
Oh yeah, gee,
student.
yeah. I had 1 year after the war to get my degree, and that was altogether different from the previous 3. Well, so now you're 1950 comes along,
Yes,
and we get involved in the Korean conflict.
that's correct.
Tell us about how you got introduced to that.
All right. When I graduated from University of Dayton, I went out to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to sign up for a job there, and I started taking a course in contract management. And the colonel came up to me one day and said, "You're an officer in the infantry, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Would you like to be an officer in the Air Force?" Well, I said, "I don't know." He said, "You can keep your job and we'll just put you in a uniform." I said, "Well, if that can be done." Of course, we were in the Korean War at that time. I said, "Fine." So about a week or 10 days later, I get noticed by telegram to report on active duty. And this colonel who was making application for me to be transferred to the Air Force shook the bush, and the infantry said, "We'll get that guy in right away. He's trying to dodge the Korean War." So I had to report on active duty at Fort Benning, Georgia, within, I think, 10 days. And I was on active duty in Fort Benning.
How about that?
I didn't mind that too much, frankly.
Yeah.
Most of my classmates were called on active duty before I was, those who had graduated with me, so I ended up in training at Fort Benning,
At
Georgia.
the infantry base, yeah.
Yes,
Well, from there, you were there for what, several months?
several months, and then I was transferred to Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky,
Oh,
and I had been hurt at Fort Benning, and I was on kind of convalescing duty. And when I arrived at Fort Benning, the captain learned that I was on kind of convalescent assignment, so he put me in charge of handling the veterans coming back from Korea to get them on the right course of where they should be hanging out or where they shouldn't be hanging out. And so I ended up there for a period of time. And while I was there, I was driving by football field, and there were football team practicing. And I got out and went over and asked, I think it was a colonel who was in charge of the team, how do you get on the football team if you played college football? He says, through me. And he said, where did you play? And I told him, and he said, do you know a fella by the name of Katzenbaum? I said, yeah, I played football with him at Dayton. He said, were you as good as he was? I said, better. Well, that night I was in a football uniform, and I contacted my captain, whom I was assigned to, and I said I was playing football. He says, hell, I thought you were on convalescent duty here. Well, I ended up for that period of time playing football. And back then, the teams traveled all over the country to keep soldiers at field entertained, and that's how I ended up playing football. And from there, I ended up overseas at the end of the season.
now you're getting down to the point where you were going to be sent overseas.
Yes.
Tell us about that and how
Well,
you got there.
I figured, well, I'm in the service. I might as well make the best of it. So I volunteered to go to Korea. And before I went to Korea, I was called into the general's office at Camp Breckenridge, and he said, we've been meeting here, and we're going to make you in charge of all athletics at Camp Breckenridge. And I said, General, I'm sorry, but I volunteered to go to Korea. He looked at me and said, you did? Well, I can't change those orders. And so I was shipped over to Korea. And I ended up, of course, in Korea.
Right.
And that was my first exposure to Korea.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that was a far distant place that most Americans knew little or nothing about. Well, now your welcome over there was a base in South Korea or something?
Well, a very short period in South Korea. It wasn't very long before I was shipped up to the battle area, which that time was, and I refer to as the Chorwan Valley, if you understand the Korean. That's about up at the 38th parallel. And I was a platoon leader, put in charge of a platoon with a 32nd Infantry Regiment of the 7th Division. And while I might just relate a little incident that happened.
Yeah, please do.
While I was there on the front line, carrying my duty out at night, going down the front line. Back then, at that time of the war, we were kind of stationed, it was a kind of a temporary station where you wouldn't move like you would normally in the war. We had ground we were going to maintain, but 38th parallel, we didn't want the Chinese and North Koreans coming south, and they didn't want us going north. So as a result, it was just kind of a stalemate there. We would operate through patrols going out in the front, the valleys, and things. So this one day, I'm going down the line, and I hear a guy calling out the code that we'd have. Typical code would be New York, response Yankee, or something like that. Here this guy came out with 4 or 5 soldiers with him, and this guy I played football with. And I was shocked. And so I took him back to my bunker, and I have a nickname, Spike, by the way, and he said, Spike, let me give you some advice while you're here. And I said, well, I'd welcome any advice. He said, you know, when we were in ROTC, they taught us that the intelligence and reconnaissance patrol would patrol in the rear during combat. He said, I want to alert you. If they ask for volunteer, and I know you volunteer from time to time, don't volunteer for the INR platoon. I said, why? He said, they'll have you out in the front. So I took that as advice, and about a month later, I get a call. Report back to G3, intelligence. And I went in there, and I sat down next to a couple of soldiers who all spit and polish guys coming over from the States, and I introduced myself to them, and they were all graduates of the West Point.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what are you here for? He says, a couple of them said to me, well, they're asking for volunteers for the INR platoon, and we're volunteering. I said, well, I'm not. So a few minutes later, I'm called in and to the officer who's interviewing, and he said to me, what'd you do back in the States? And I told him that I was in special services. Well, that's a no-no in combat. That's a singer, a dancer, somebody like that. I didn't realize he had my portfolio in front of him. Yeah, I was in special service, but I was a boxing instructor and also football player. So when he asked me, he said, would you like to join the INR platoon? Oh, no. I said, no, I'm not qualified to handle a job like that. He said, well, let me think about it. And before I got up to leave, he said, you know what? I'm going to gamble on you. You volunteered. I said, I did? So I'm in the INR platoon. That night, I'm over in the enemy territory watching the Chinese do their laundry. I was on a patrol.
Wow.
At a reconnaissance, and I thought, oh my God, what a job. But I learned at that point that they weren't using West Pointers anymore, because at that point they had lost a number of West Point graduates in that class, and so they were picking out others. So that was my first experience. By the way, the colonel that interviewed me, or major colonel, I forget exact rank, he said, Lieutenant, if after 30 days you do okay as an INR leader, we'll make you a company commander. I thought, well, isn't that a nice prize? Make me a company commander over here on the front lines. So that was my experience, my first experience over there at that point in time. But I eventually became a company commander.
Who was the who was the commander of the 7th at that time? Do you remember?
The commander at that time was Smith, General Smith.
General Smith.
Yeah, I can remember it because I was told that he was tough, rough. Of course, I never met him, but they had a parade back south in Korea, and apparently one of the officers took off his badge or whatever he had, and when he went by, he threw it at the general. And I never heard of anything like that, but he was in charge of 7th Division at that time. And he was replaced, and I don't recall who replaced him, but of course, I was at a place at that time where generals didn't come up and introduce themselves.
True.
That's for sure.
Well, now you're, what time of the year did you get over there?
I got over there in the early part of the year. It was, I know there were some battles going on at Heartbreak Ridge, which was down the line, and there were, what would happen at that time while I was over there, you had, as I'd indicated before, the 38th parallel, and that was the front line.
Yeah.
But out in front of the front line, you had outposts. Obviously, outposts were to, to protect the ground out there so that they didn't come in and into the front lines. And you had outposts, which was referred to as Heartbreak Ridge, the Triangle, Jane Russell Hill. These were just a bunch of hills that are out in front of the front line where we were up high, and then there was a valley, and then you had these outposts where you'd have units, small units, but the most well-known, and while I was over there, was Old Baldy, Triangle, Heartbreak Ridge, and of course, Pork Chop Hill, which I became quite acquainted with. But I can tell you when, at one point, Old Baldy was occupied by the Colombians. And I had heard that the Colombians, I don't know what brought this about, but they were all asleep at night. And North Koreans and Chinese overran Old Baldy, which was a big loss for us because it was right out in front of our frontline area. And I can remember that they wiped out the whole Columbia unit. And what I observed was they were carrying them out in bags. I'll never forget that. That was my experience with the Old Baldy. It was well written up and talked about in our area. And Old Baldy, unfortunately, was between the front line and some of the other outposts, particularly Pork Chop Hill. Old Baldy was higher than Pork Chop Hill, higher than some of the other outposts, and as a result, the Chinese and North Koreans made a lot out of that because they used that as a base to, for artillery fire. And right at this time, there was discussion about an armistice. Maybe they're going to settle. And for some obvious reason, the Chinese, and I keep making reference to Chinese because in my experience over in Korea, I became involved in firefights with the Chinese. They were they're Mongolians, big Chinamen, not the little guys, but Mongolians, more so than North Korea. And I often have given seminars, and I've said, we didn't fight the North Koreans, we fought the Chinese. Let's recognize it. The North Koreans, they didn't do much. It was the Chinese.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, they used Old Baldy, the Chinese did, in order to fire on all these other outposts that we had on the front line. Now, up to that point, in my position, we carried out a lot of patrols. A patrol would be manned by an officer and may be labeled as an assault patrol, where you would go over an outpost that was occupied by the Chinese in a firefight. Or you may have just a reconnaissance patrol, maybe 5 or 6 soldiers with an officer, where you would go out and just observe what was going on. The purpose, of course, was to protect the front line, protect that 38th parallel. And sometimes you'd go out on a patrol. I've been out on patrol where we would go out, we were told to mount ourselves at a certain position, and within 10, 15 yards, maybe the Chinese had one that they mounted themselves. We didn't bother them, they didn't bother us. Our job was reconnaissance, not to conduct any firefighting.
Right.
But I spent, and of course at that time I was in charge of the intelligence reconnaissance, and that was all patrols.
Mm-hmm.
I spent many, many nights just conducting patrols, going out in the valley with various assignments, maybe an assault patrol, maybe a reconnaissance patrol, and just observing what was going on. And normally, incidentally, when you're out there, you're in rice paddies, and you're up to your waist laying in.
Now, were you afoot, or did you have a jeep? Or?
Oh no, not on patrols. You go out there and slip around
Quiet.
out in the fight. And it was just unbelievable. You would have the front line, then you'd have a valley that would go out for maybe miles, which would be swampy area, and that's where you would carry out your patrols. I often commented in seminars, I've said, I'm a patrol expert, not a combat expert. At least that's my experience over there. You'd set up patrols in different ways. Now, I usually would set up my patrols if we were to mount ourselves in a U or a Y. I'd set them up so that if the Chinese would come in, you'd be able to close them off on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And if they come in off to the side, you'd have a couple soldiers that would be marked up. It was all strategic, but you dare not carry out an assault patrol if you were to carry out a reconnaissance patrol. But that was my experience, my initial experience on the front line.
Now, what year was this now?
Well, now this was the war began in June of 1950.
50.
I got over there in 1952. The war ended, as I recall, around, I should remember the date, it is in July of 1953. That was when the armistice was signed. But it was a period right before the war ended, where there was most of the activity that I was engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
It was unbelievable the way things were carried out then. There were always signs the war's going to end. And we'd get different reports back from behind the line where, we'd be careful that war's going to end. But the Chinese and the North Koreans want to do everything they can in our area, which was the Chorwan Valley area, which was about 25 miles from Seoul. And in their negotiations in Panmunjom, they wanted to impress upon the Americans that they wanted Seoul. They wanted to move the 38th parallel 25 miles south to take Seoul. If they could get the capital, they'd sign a peace treaty. So what stood in the role in their prevented them from getting Seoul was, of course, they took Old Baldy Hill, and there was Pork Chop, and they put the word out that we're going to do everything we can before we sign a treaty to get Pork Chop Hill, because that opens the gates. We can go then to Old Baldy and then right down to Seoul and take Seoul.
Sure.
So while they're negotiating this armistice, and they had reached a point where they were exchanging prisoners. while they're exchanging prisoners, the Chinese are fighting to get down to Seoul. They're accelerating all their fighting. And it happened to be in our area. Now, we also observed that the Marines was adjoining to us, but they didn't seem to mess around with the Marines, and I don't know. I think they went after our unit, and they would. It was an unbelievable type of warfare. For example, I was with the 32nd Regiment of the 7th Division. There was a 31st and there was 17th. But when we moved up, loudspeaker from across the valley would say, "Welcome, 32nd Infantry Regiment of the 7th Division. You're going to like it up here." And greet us and carried out that kind of a propaganda warfare. They knew where we were at all times. Now, we know you have patrols out by Old Baldy, but we're not going to bother you because you're going to be disappointed. Your wives, girlfriends, and everything are out having a good time tonight. You like it out there in the swampy mud, don't you? And that they carry out that kind of propaganda. Yeah. And then females would get on the loudspeaker from across it and greet us, and after a while, begin to get to you.
Sure.
Psychologically.
Yep.
But they worked on our area, and I later learned that the reason they worked on our area is they wanted to make sure they could get down to Seoul. And until they could get to Seoul, they weren't going to sign an armistice at Panmunjom. So it got to the point where Pork Chop Hill became a talking point of all of us on the front lines. We'd gotten word that they were going to make a special crew up of soldiers who had had experience in patrolling, who had been on the front lines for some time, and they were going to select a group of officers who would go on to Pork Chop Hill. The unit, when I was first assigned there, we had about a company, which at that time, company consisted of 4 platoons. It was around 200 soldiers, reinforced with machine gunners and things of that nature. And we were assigned there, and when I was first assigned there, I and another officer, we were put in charge. And we went on to the outpost. The outpost, I noticed, was whoever was there before us had dug trenches around the front, and you'd think they were going to dig it down to heaven. They were so deep that the average height guy couldn't even look over to see if anybody was out in front. But anyway, we were assigned to that particular area, put on notice that we're going to be prepared in case the Chinese make the run, which they indicated they wanted to make before they took Seoul.
Sure.
So we were there for, I imagine, 4 or 5, not 4 or 5 weeks, a couple weeks. And each day we're getting reports, the war's going to be over, so don't worry, you're going to come back. So then they stepped it up, the Chinese did, and we would have on an outpost, we would have observers, 1 or 2 guys that would go out into the front area to, alert us if there was any activity out there.
Sure.
And on the occasion, of course, I won't forget, getting a call back from one of the observers who said, Lieutenant, there's all kinds of soldiers coming out here. I said, well, how many? He says, I can't even count them. We had around a couple hundred soldiers on the hill. I said, well, what do you mean you can't count them? He says, there are thousands out here. He said, I can't believe it. So they moved in on the pork chop. And that's where we engaged in the trenches, hand to hand, for about 3 days. And that's where, my experience was in pork chop. And they took pork chop from us.
It was a terrible job, wasn't it?
And our people, topside, had indicated we're going to do everything to get pork chop back. So they committed several battalions, and they finally got the hill back. But I was in the initial group that was overrun by the Chinese when they hit us with around 1,000 people, and we, with a company which was pretty well wiped out.
My goodness.
So that was my experience on the Pork Chop Hill. But we did end up getting it back. When I got back off of the hill, I had later learned that they're going to make a movie of it, which they did. And the movie's a distortion that shows what happened in efforts to get it back. Didn't show what happened when the Chinese overran us. And I should mention, in my experience of dealing with the Chinese, when they hit our hill, would call us goats. They'd always call out goats. So, that was my experience there. And,
now the weather, how about the weather?
well, now this was in the late spring, it was June and July of -- wasn't too bad there. But let me tell you, before that, it was cold. Before, at least my experience before going on to Pork Chop Hill, it was cold. It was about as cold as you could imagine. So that's.
Well, that's.
In fact, I often said that in the over there in Korea is the only place you could stand in the mud and not be able to see because of the dust. So that was.
Yeah.
I didn't
quite
like,
an analogy,
yeah,
I should say.
but that was my experience.
Well, many of us back here, little did we really realize what was going on. I was lucky I wasn't called back. But that television program, comedy, drama, MASH, was sort of a, I don't know. I always felt a little uncomfortable watching that because, of course, they made light of their terrible situation. And have you seen that?
No, I haven't.
Any of those
No, I tell
episodes?
you, there's a couple things that, in my experience over in Korea, that number one, I do not ever like fireworks. I don't. And you know, because of my experience over there when they'd shoot, you know, from the back, shoot out fireworks every night to light up the front to see if any Chinese were coming up. So I don't enjoy fireworks, and I really don't enjoy movies where there's battle. I just don't have any
I
desire
understand.
to see those.
I understand.
There's just something that's carried on. And also, I got to tell you, when for the years after I first got back, I never would sleep except on my back. Never sleep except on my back. Never on the side, or you know, because of, I don't know, just a short period of time over there, a year, but I just learned, you know, that's not the way I was going to.
Certain ways,
Yeah,
sure.
certain ways, and there's just certain things that I couldn't adjust to.
Right. Well, the lack of understanding over here, mainland, about what was going on over there and why we were there, and then you had people like Mark Clark, you know, General Clark, who had performed rather badly in Italy, and brought him back and brought him over to Korea, and the press didn't seem to support like they did World War II.
You raise an interesting point. I have heard from so many sources when I came back from Korea and up to the present time, characterizations by politicians, newspapers, I think, where they characterize the Korean War as Truman said, and I read this in the Congress, when they inquired what the war was or what was going on in Korea, he says it's just a police action.
Yes. Oh.
Then I've heard
Terrible.
comments where some have said that it's just a firefight over there.
Yeah.
And you hear all these politicians putting it down. Well, they didn't recognize that 2 million soldiers were killed. Around 500,000 GIs, Americans. And they have no idea of what happened over there. And they like to forget about it.
Yeah.
And they
yeah,
like
they
to,
wanted to push it back.
Yeah, and that's one of my pet peeves.
Oh, absolutely.
And, you know, when I see how they've treated Korean veterans, it's bothered me.
Oh,
It still bothers me. And I guess what bothers me more is just the way they treat soldiers. For example, I read an article where Congress was coming out with a bill that was going to be all-inclusive, and among others, the congressman had veterans in the bill. Oh, no, we don't put in veterans. Veterans are these guys we're having trouble with now who were trained to kill in these wars, and they're coming back here creating problems. They removed the word veteran and put in place of the word veteran pedophiles. Protect them, but not the veterans. And I've got evidence to show that has been done in Congress. So it's, and that's one of my pet peeves. And
well, I can certainly understand.
Korean veterans, I have observed, have had difficult times getting benefits
Yes.
that other soldiers have gotten because of the label that they weren't in a war.
Sure.
They were in a firefight. They were in just
Yeah.
One-
It was demeaned. It wasn't understood, and people and you know, it was so close to the end of World War II, and we were so thankful to get that war over with. And we concentrated on domestic problems. And I can understand how you would feel about that, Bob.
Yeah, they call it the forgotten war, and it is
Yeah.
forgotten. And you know what really bothered me since, and I often make this comment, Truman, at the time, President Truman, was being advised by Dean Acheson. Now, what's the background of Dean Acheson? Dean Acheson was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Now, I can imagine me as a lawyer advising the president on a war, what to do and how to do it. Truman did not understand what war was. And you know, the Korean War was one of the few wars where we didn't win the war. Mm-hmm. Number two, we never fought the war like a war should be fought because of the orders that came down. We're not going to use any kind of atomic weapons or anything of that nature. And we fought a war that we wanted to use soldiers primarily to fight their soldiers. So they'd use mass of soldiers. We would have just small numbers. Mm-hmm. We didn't have advance. I often think of the time when we were on the front lines and we had heard that they were moving up on us and call back for artillery fire to penetrate the valley where they were. And I experienced this myself, where I'd called back and I get a response that said, "I'm sorry, Lieutenant, but we've shot up your allotment." God. And they're out in front. Now, of course, I was exaggerating with them how many were out there. There were probably maybe 1,000 out in the valley, but you know, I said, you know, we got a couple thousand people out here going to overrun us, and we've overused our allotment. Now, that's the way I had experienced when we were over in Korea, and you know, it's sad. It's really sad.
Well, it is sad, and it seems to even exist somewhat today in our actions in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and so forth. The rules of warfare have changed.
No question about it. It's sad.
And it's demeaning and demoralizing. Well, now, so how did you get the news that you were going to be coming home?
Well, I was shipped down to Tucson, and I had a choice. I had a choice to get on a ship that was going to leave the next day, or I could wait and get on a ship that was going to go around, maybe in the ocean would take them about a month to get home, or I could wait maybe in the next 2 or 3 days and go out on a plane. I had my choice. You could imagine the choice I took. It was get on that ship today, to get going today. But they gave me a real bonus. They put me in charge of the brig.
Oh boy!
Guys who had been objectors, who had refused to fight, and I had the worst group there than I ran into in combat.
My goodness!
I mean, I'd had to go in the cells unarmed to, you know, see that they were fed, and I thought, boy, what a job this is. And we were out at sea for about, I guess it was several weeks getting back to the States. But I had my brig, which consists of about 50 soldiers who
Really?
were being discharged and dishonorably and everything else.
Right.
But I often remember the only thing I had to offer them as an incentive was if you really stay in line and you don't cause any trouble, I'll see if I can get you to go through the mess hall first. Finally, we did, and I was so proud that we were able to do it. But that was my experience with the.
Oh, I should say.
But
Well, you came back directly to California, did you?
came
or-
back to California and then back to, I think, Fort Knox.
Mhm.
And then I was honorably discharged there and was able then to go to law school. But
Well,
that was my-
of course, you were thankful for that and
Yeah.
looking forward to getting back into family and civilian life and so forth. And did you have your degree in law before you went over, or no?
No, I
You got
had,
that afterward?
I had my degree in undergraduate school, and before I went into the service, I applied for law school and received notice that I'd be given a scholarship for 3 years of law school. They pay everything.
Wow.
If I could give them assurance that I wouldn't go into service since I was an officer. Well, it was a Korean War.
Oh,
I couldn't give them that assurance.
no.
But anyway, when I was discharged from the service, I reapplied and asked them about my scholarship. And they said, well, that scholarship's not on the table now because you went to service. So then I became a lawyer without being licensed by arguing, you mean because I went to service, I lose my scholarship?
For heaven's
When I
sake.
got my scholarship, it was because of my grades in undergraduate
Well, of
school.
course.
Those grades have never changed.
No.
And the dean then reviewed it, and I ended up getting my scholarship. And I remember when I graduated from law school, at the ceremony, he made a big point of it to tell everybody how I fought for my scholarship, that I got it. So that was my experience there. So I got it after.
Well, that was that was interesting. You had another battle to fight.
Yeah, I did, and I advocated that I ought to have it. I got it, and so as a result, the veterans, the Korean veterans, received so much a month. Again, they got cheated. The World War II veterans would go to, if they went to Notre Dame, they got paid for Notre Dame. They went to Harvard, they paid the school for what you pay at Harvard. Whatever the school charged, the government paid.
Right.
Korean veterans receive so much a month. Now, why do I complain about that? Because they paid you so little that if you were able to go to Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Notre Dame, you didn't get enough money
No.
to finance that. And that was one of I thought, the short ends of the way they treated the veteran, the Korean veterans. And I
should say.
I just think that that's an example of where Korean veterans have not been treated properly.
Oh, yeah, it was so political. My golly. Yeah, the politicians really messed that up. And then, of course, the follow-up, the Vietnam War, was also
Probably the same type of
mishandled.
experience. Yes.
Very badly mishandled, I should say. Well, Bob, it's you've raised 5 children, and you've had a successful law practice. You've been a community contributor, and we thank you for that, and of course for your service in the Army and in the Korean War. Anything else come to mind that
No,
you'd like to?
No, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be interviewed.
Well, it's an honor for
I think
us.
this is a worthy cause to become a participant in, so that others can share in the experience what others have had.
Well, that's the situation, and the nice thing is you get a DVD of this interview, and a copy is sent to the Library of Congress in Washington Archives, and a copy is kept here. So you're on record, you're history.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And people can look you up, get it on the website, and all that sort of thing. Takes a little time, but we get it worked out. And again, we thank you for making the effort to come here and open up your life and so forth. And it's been a privilege for me to have the honor of interviewing you. So God bless, good luck, and
Thank
good
you.
health.
It's been a real privilege to meet you and to participate with you.
Well, thank you.